Good evening, Kriegspielers. I have a cup of tea here, and I have an after-action report for you. So, let's get right into the game. This will be the after-action report for Grenia On March, a interactive war game based off of the Stoneworks Minecraft server, which was an absolute blast to host. With that said, let's get into nation objectives. Due to the manner of which this war game was set up, there were multiple nations involved. Three of which, in a way, were on the same team, one of which being Marisfalor. Marisfalor has a few objectives, one of which is a minor tactical victory. The goal of this is to show Marisfalorian prowess, another of which is to maintain minor losses, similar to the first. But Grenia cannot be defeated is an interesting one, since they don't want to be steamrolled by Zalatra, but bleeding out Grenia is encouraged in order to weaken them for future rivalries. Again, though, they can't be defeated. Next up to the bat, we have Zalatra, our defending nation. Their goals will thus be fairly simple, but the difficult part will be the execution of these goals against a multi-front coalition. The most obvious goal will be to defend Zalatran territory. This is the goal of a defensive nation in any case. Another goal, though, will be to win as soon as possible. This is due to the internal unrest in Zalatra which the army must respond to. There is also the goal to destroy as much of the enemy as possible in detail, with the goal to prevent a future attack on Zalatran territory. Finally, we have Grenia, our primary aggressor nation. Their goals, thus, should be fairly obvious. Obviously, one is using coalition warfare to launch a combined assault on Zalatra. They will have the goal to destroy the Zalatran navy and the goal of minimizing casualties. With this said, here's the map of these nations and their rough geographic location. Order of battle. First up, we have Marisfalor, whose order of battle was such, representing 2 cavalry-heavy, light on the artillery divisions, perfect for wide open terrain, as well as 3 fairly modern ironclads, with the caveat that they were broadside focused rather than turreted. Next up, we have Zalatra, with an unreasonably sized force of a grand total of not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 divisions with a heavy artillery focus while mostly skimping out on localized cavalry. The reason for this infantry-heavy approach should be fairly noticeable due to the terrain of which Marisfalor would likely be fighting in, that being fairly forested and fairly urban depending on which area specifically in the front line. At the beginning of the game, the Zalatra Navy was in quite dire straits, with only 2 functioning ships. However, using the inspection system, which all nations were told they had access to, they were able to acquire roughly 2 functioning ironclads to use in the upcoming naval battles. Next up, we have Grenia, with a combined force of 2 divisions, with the caveat that one of these divisions is armed with way more modernized equipment than the other teams, roughly a decade or 2 ahead, including needle-nose rifles, repeaters, and Gatling guns. Before we continue, a few notes to be had about the orders of battle. The Marisfalorian team is specialized for wide, flat terrain, while the Grenian and Navarian teams are fairly versatile, but are focused more on urban and forested combat. The Zalatran team has a heavy focus on artillery and a slight manpower advantage, but this is mostly achieved by militia and at the cost of their cavalry corps. Let's play a game inside of a game. Here's the map of the coalition area. Notice the bridge crossings here, and remember that this is the entire map you're looking at. So, think, where would you launch the coalition attack from? Would you put all your forces in the east, putting a token force in the west to launch your defense? Or would you put all your forces in the west while leaving a token force in the east on the canal? Or would you put all your forces spread across the entire front line and launch a massive assault that would make a Russian commander blush? Have you thought it through yet? Have you seen any possible issues? It is obviously not the third option, as this will lead to multiple issues in command, structure, and overall spreading your force way too thin against a force which you know is roughly equal to your own strength. Also note that this plan would likely have Mars Valor committing to a two-front offensive. Plans. In case it hasn't been known by now, the purple, modernized troops of the Grenian team will be arriving from the sea, hence the purple arrow up top. But, as you can see by the map, they have chosen the plan of attacking everywhere at the same time. Not related to planning, I just thought it was funny to put it in here. Zalatra, meanwhile, has a much simpler plan. Their goal is to launch a minor naval prodding in the west, contain a token force in the west with the goal of falling back, while launching a combined offensive in the east with the goal of encircling the Mars Valorian army. Congrats! You're 6 minutes in, and we can finally start the game. At 0800, we see the following deployments along the map. In the west, we have the Ephesia deployment with the goal of bombarding Fort Edel into submission, which would last a long time even if they were not interrupted by a Grenian assault, due to the fact that Fort Edel is a star fortress and they were besieging it with field guns, which would have lasted probably the next 1,000 years. Meanwhile, out east, we have the Mars Valorian deployment, ready to continue their offensive right into a Zalatran trap, as well as the center deployment, which really has no activity yet. Meanwhile, in the west, the boats do be the boating. And at 8:20, the boats spot each other. Unfortunately for our northern Zalatran commander, it turns out that buildings can only be so cannon-proof, as an unholy onslaught of iron shot is unleashed upon his forces, as well as a combined Grenian infantry assault. So far in the east, everything's looking up for Mars Valor. They've managed a quite good defensive, positioned their artillery well, but the signs of a deteriorating situation could already be seen with hindsight. The fact that their cavalry is already in engagement with a force they can't see, when they're already facing a division force, and the cavalry of 2 divisions should be raising alarm bells, much less the fact that their cavalry reports another entire division. This info should have been noticed earlier, but it was lost in the heat of the moment. Meanwhile, the central Zalatran infantry assault is sloppy at best, with their men wandering aimlessly through the swamps while trying to deal with the thin land bridge of actual land, as our artillery luckily redeploys. The Guard division in the south is having more success, but is being slowed by professional Mars Valorian cavalry. In breaking news, do not trust militia with the stacking up of artillery wagons. After being ordered to move the wagons away from the front and into the town, the militia took this to the extreme, stacking up nearly an entire division's worth of artillery into a single city block. Coincidentally, this was the same turn that Mars Valor attempted The following explosion was so disastrous, it was heard nearly around the entire map, and almost sent the Zalatran commander flying off of his tower. It also was able to significantly damage some naval vessels due to their close proximity to the blast. It also destroyed most of the Zalatran artillery in the area. Meanwhile, in the east, the Mars Valorians are continuing to hold their position against a heavy assault. At this point, they know that there is at least a Guards division of some kind to the southwest of them, 2 divisions in front of them, and a cavalry force to their east. This should again be raising alarm bells. Meanwhile, the Zalatran force in Protozoons is having the opposite of a good time, as they have been worn down by repeated volleys of heavy artillery fire and a Pickett's charge-worthy assault. Now, before we continue, I do want to pause to look at the situation at 0900, as this is one of the pivotal turning points of the game, as I'm sure you can see. And so it's time for the tactical lore dump. Let us look at the map. Here we can see the rough vectors of advance from both teams, as well as the Zelatran route in the center. We can also see the power projection of forces as the Mars Valorians are getting quite obviously thrashed in the east. When the coalition finds out about this, what should they do? Should they A. continue the push in the west, but allow Mars Valor to defend their now open flank? B. Work together to consolidate their lines and redeploy forces and reorganize into a proper reserve? Or is there a third option? A third option so insane that nobody would do it. The correct answer was obviously C. Actively prevent their allies from returning back to defend the flank, curse them out as cowards for failing, ignore the situation, and ask for no further context while continuing an offensive deeper into enemy territory. Naval player jump scare. Here's a mid-resolution shot of the Zelatran cavalry sneaking between Zelatran lines, as well as their offensive. Meanwhile, we can see the Mars Valorian prisoners being rounded up, and the preparations for the next Zelatran offensive. And at the same time of all this conflict, the naval slugfest begins in earnest, as the first true volleys of the battle are exchanged. Also, I'm sorry, Raptor, but this was your gameplay, and I'm not showing a screenshot of your men just walking in the woods. There are certainly worlds where the Grenian team wins this dice roll, as the Zelatran CIC is caught out in the open by Grenian cavalry, but manages to escape. Meanwhile, the naval battles continue, with a whole bunch of ramming this turn, including the Unwavering, which was rammed twice at the same time. The Zelatrans managed to break one of the Mars Valorian ship's rudder. While I wouldn't advise hitting an enemy head-on, especially when they're under sail power, and the wind's coming from the northwest, which led to, as we'll see later, an issue when it came to separation of the ramming. Meanwhile, the slugfest of the century continues in the west, as the Grenians begin to manage an upper hand due to the Zelatran artillery running out of ammo. Wonder where it went. The fighting continues out in the east as the Guard Division prepares its final defense on Kairos as its artillery finishes redeployment. Zoomed out image of the localized battlefield. Also at 1000 hours, we see the Red Hammer get absolutely beaten to crap by a double-sided broadside, knocking it out of the battle for the next hour and a half, roughly. This was basically a turn of repositioning on both teams, as the Grenians finished their battle in the west, and the Mars Valorians were pushed back to the river line in the east, as the Zelatrans consolidated their lines. But you know what this means. 2 back-to-back naval turns of mostly slugfest and the Red Hammer trying to repair itself, and 1 beautiful magazine detonation on the Kuriznia. Finally back on land, we can see Raptor and the Grenian combined offensive sweeping up the remains of the Zelatran West during its withdrawal to their final stronghold city. In the east, though, we can see the elite infantry of the Zelatran forces launching a textbook Prussian assault over the bridge. At 11:20, forces are tense as the Avarians have arrived in force and have begun a major assault on the Zelatran south, while the Grenian line is already showing signs of weakness in the north. However, at this point I will note that the Grenians don't really need to continue the offensive at this point. They've completed their goal of causing major infrastructure damage. And a urban assault is risky. Also, they can already see from their scouts at least a division, possibly 2, arriving to defend the city. And at the same time, Mars Valor is clearly in trouble, as their population, already doubting the war effort from the start, is now in open riot due to the fact that not only is cannon shot hitting their town, but there are commie boots in it. But you didn't come here to see land army smash, you wanted to see the Navy front. So, here's the Navy front. It's long range combat. What did you expect? Ramming? There's going to be some more, but I mean, what do you want? At 1140, it's clear that the Grenian offensive is failing in the north, and that the Zalotran army, at worst, will be able to break out, as the Avarian forces are fairly new still and will likely move through the Zalotran south, forcing the Zalotrans back to Zunes. But Darter, if they run back to Zunes, they'll be running back to enemy territory. Yeah? The only issue is that the enemy territory is now occupied by the Zalotran army. Due to the collapse of Marsflor, an entire division of Zalotran troops is now marching up the streets of Vale There is still some hope, though. Perhaps if the Greenians can win quick enough, and they didn't. Okay, well, that's a Zalotran victory. Well, team critiques. Not much to critique, Zalatra. You won. I will say your navy was not able to position itself in time to affect the Avarian redeployment, which would have been a great help, but they did manage to actually take on the Mars-Valorian fleet, which was not expected. You also had some issues with your CIC imagining the situation. Due to a couple vague dispatches, he believed you had already had forces in Vale Verda for quite some time, which led to some communication complications. Specifically with your AI ran cavalry, it was very confused when it was ordered to continue attacking Vale Verda while it was in like east, like in the flatlands of Kairos. Although, well done. You had a plan. It was simple. You stuck to it, and it worked. You killed the Mars-Valorian army. Mars-Valor, I know I can feel your players cramping up behind the screen. Don't worry, this isn't going to be a trash talk. It's going to be looking at what you could do better, specifically around your deployment and the method of which you underwent it, so you can improve in future games. Now, obviously hindsight's 2020, but you had a rough idea of the enemy deployment and should have seen the complications of deploying a sub-practical force at best this far away from your lines. If you were going to undergo this position, you should have moved your entire army to give you the best shot as possible. Kudos to you. You didn't quit when you lost half your army in the first 3 turns. You stayed in the game and lasted longer than I expected you to, especially with what we're about to talk about with the team sabotage. Okay, Grenia. You did quite well. You performed good assaults, and more than any team really, relied on dispatchers to communicate information. But your critical flaw, in my opinion, was how you dealt with the Mars-Valorian crisis. There is a saying that if I owe you $100, I have a problem. But if I owe you $100,000, you have a problem. So, let's see the problem. The problem is that Mars-Valor owes you half a division, and you need them to defend your flank. So, even if it is their fault, which you thought it was and were quite pointing about, you still need to defend them, because they're defending you. While the Mars-Valorians did not ask directly for help, these dispatches on screen now, you can pause it if you want, should have been a very good clue of the situation you were dealing with. And not to sound harsh, but at the time of the game when you received this letter, you had already effectively beat the Zalotrans in Protozoons, and were pushing them out of Ephesia. You had the reserves in the form of the Avarians to deploy to aid Marsflor. And yes, they didn't ask precisely for aid, but these dispatches should have been enough to realize that they needed help. While, again, they didn't ask for it, it was necessary. Again, their front is your front. With that said, though, I believe that's all the critique I have, and thank you for listening to this Umpire After Action Report.